With it being October and having Halloween right around the corner, I decided to make a Halloween-themed game in Unreal using only Unreal Engine Marketplace assets. So the first thing I did is obviously found some assets. You can see here I have one with some enemies, and I also found one with some pumpkins and a few other pieces of scenic geometry. The first thing I did was began working on a character. I decided to go with this grunt character because it was pretty simple, and I wanted a small character that I could have many of that were not very powerful. So I scaled the capsule down to make him fit inside, and then I began working on his material. The content pack came with two different materials, so I just really quickly set up a random initialization in the begin play to switch between the different materials when the character is spawned. And then just to test this out, I drag in a few of these goblins and run it a couple times, and you can see each time I run it, it switches between randomly the green and the blue material. Next, I wanted to get him to start walking, so I created a walking blend space, which was very simple, which will just interpolate from walking to running. And inside of the animation blueprint, I started hooking this up and passing in the speed value so that it would animate at the correct speed. Once I had that working, I dragged him in just to test it, and of course it did. Next, I needed a idle state so that when he's not moving, he will not be walking. And you can see right here, I'm just setting that up inside the animation blueprint, and I added transition nodes so that he will start walking once his speed gets faster than 0, and he'll go back to idle once it gets less than or close to 0. So you can see right there, his idle is working correctly. Next, I retweaked his capsule so that he would fit a little bit better, and I began trying to figure out and get some inspiration from this marketplace asset what I wanted for my game. What you saw at the beginning was the final version of the game, but at this point I didn't know exactly what I was going to do, so I was trying to figure it out as I go, which is usually how I work. I decided to make a base using a large pumpkin, and that this large pumpkin was going to be the thing that you were protecting, kind of like a tower defense. Here I'm just spending some time trying to get the scale right and dragging in a couple goblins just to compare the two. The next thing, I added a nav mesh so that our goblin could actually walk and get to the pumpkin. At this point, I thought the enemies were going to come from all different directions, so I put the pumpkin in the middle and I put the enemy on the outside. Now, to get the character to actually walk, I had to give him some AI, so I added a AI controller and a behavior tree and a blackboard, which is what I'm doing here. And inside of the behavior tree, I set up the blackboard so that the character would have different states, which is what I'm doing right here. So the goblin has different states, which is just an enum I created, and he'll go between idle and moving to the target. I added some nodes so that the character could actually move to his goal, and I added a goal variable to the blackboard. And this is something we'll have to set later, but this goal is essentially going to be set to whatever he's trying to get to. So in this case, the pumpkin base in the middle. Inside of the AI controller, I then set it up to run the behavior tree and the blackboard. And I created a game mode so I could actually set up the game to run with this player controller and all of the blueprints that I was creating. Also inside of the game mode, I got a reference to the game base, or sorry, to the base, which is the pumpkin, so that anybody can easily get access to this pumpkin base whenever they want. The next thing I did was add an accessor for this base and created a simple wrapper function inside of a library to easily get access to the game mode. With all that working and setting him up to run his behavior tree, you can see he now walks towards the pumpkin. However, he is doing something weird where he's going around behind the back of the pumpkin. So I decided to add 4 different waypoint nodes to the pumpkin, one on each of the 4 sides. And then inside of the pumpkin class, I added a function here that says get closest attack location. And this will get the closest one of those 4 points based on where the goblin is coming from. So that way, if he comes from one side, he will end up walking directly to that side. You can see here I tried to run it and it didn't quite work. And I realized that there's actually an issue where the character cannot move to scene components. He has to either move to an actor or a location. So I switched the target inside the blackboard to be a vector for the location, updated the code, and reran it. And as you can see here, he now moves to the attack location in front of the character. Just to test this working, I added 4 more on each side and ran it, and as you can see, each one walks up to the correct side based on where they're coming from. So the next thing I need to do is make it so we can actually attack. You can see right here I just spent a little bit of time adjusting the color to make it a little bit more Halloweenish. And I also wanted to add a health to the pumpkin so that when we attacked it, it could actually take damage. So here I'm just setting up a simple health bar, which I'm going to add to the top of the screen, which will keep track of the base's health, and each time an enemy hits it, it will get depleted a little bit. Here I'm just adding some bindings to when the health changes so that the UI can get updated appropriately. I like to use bindings in the UI as much as possible so that I will have callbacks for when stuff changes, and I don't have to continuously check inside of the widget. The next thing I decided to do is start working on the player. So the player in this case is actually quite simple. It's really just a camera. So I add a pawn and a controller, and I add a camera inside of the pawn class, and I move the player so that he starts above and looking down at the scene. Because like I said, I originally thought this was going to be more top down and I would have enemies coming from each side, but as you know, later on I changed that. So this is my original thought. I also modified the walk speed of the enemies so that their speed matches better with the animation, which is what you see here. After this, inside the begin play, I add the health bar to the screen, so at the top middle you can see the health bars there, and then I test it real quick by setting the value to something like 70, just to make sure it wasn't full by default all the time. Next, I added an attacking AI state to the enumeration, and I began hooking that up inside of the behavior tree so that the goblin could actually attack. I made a task for setting the AI state to attack, which is what you see here. And so inside of the behavior tree, I can now set his AI state to attacking after he moves to the target. And so right here, I'm rearranging the behavior tree so that he can go between the two different states of idle and attacking. And inside of the attacking task, I get the goblin and I get his mesh, and I play a specific montage on it, which is the attack montage. Now I haven't actually created that yet, so inside of here I begin creating the animation montage for the goblin, where I add the attack animation. Now there's actually two, one for each hand, the left and the right. So you can see here we have the right hand attack, and also there is the left hand attack. And I wanted him to switch between these attacks randomly. So you can see right here, I did something similar to what I did for the materials, where I get a random integer, and I use that random integer to figure out which one of these to play. Next, I add that task to the behavior tree and add a simple wait after it. So you can see now they will attack, and then they'll wait a second, and they will attack again. Now, of course, right now they're not doing any damage because I haven't written any of that code. At this point, I decided to refactor it slightly, and inside of the goblin class is where I actually put the attack code because I thought it was better suited there. And I also wanted to move it there because that was going to be the place where I would do the damage. So you can see right here I'm adding montage notifies to my montage for when the damage should be applied. And then inside the goblin I check for that. So whenever I get the notify inside the animation to attack, which is about when his hand gets in front of him like he's punching, it will then start triggering this code. So right here I'm just writing a function to perform a line trace based on the direction he's facing and forward. So it's basically just going to shoot out a line in front of him, and anything it's going to hit, it's going to apply damage to. Now for this, I decided to create an interface called the health interface, and this will have a function called damage. And so that way, regardless of what he's looking at, I don't have to do a bunch of casting. I can simply just say damage, and if it implements this interface, like the base, the pumpkin, then the pumpkin can handle damaging itself as needed. So you can see now I have these red lines coming out, which are the line traces. And the only thing left to do now is inside the base, which is the pumpkin, is to implement this health interface and allow the pumpkin to damage itself. And you can see there you go. So now each time one of the goblins hits the pumpkin, the health bar at the top depletes a little bit based on its health. Next, I start rearranging the scene and adding a little bit of life to it. So you can see right here I'm adding some fences and some fence poles, and I also moved all the enemies to start on the right. I dragged in a couple of the other pumpkins from the pack that I got from the marketplace and began adding it around the main base along with some small plants. The idea here is that I wanted to create sort of a boundary between where the attackers are coming from and this pumpkin patch, being the idea that the monsters would be coming trying to destroy the pumpkin patch, and this big pumpkin base is what you are trying to protect. So I add some pumpkins behind it to give that sort of illusion. Again, I'm no artist, and I'm just using what I found on the marketplace to get the general idea across. Next, I added a sort of simple forest effect on the right where the enemies could come out of, so they're not just spawning in thin air. And I moved these attack waypoints all to be in front of the base so that characters would no longer go around behind it. And now they are moving to different attack points in front of the base and starting the attack animation. Next, I started working on an enemy spawner so that I could have enemies spawn in waves. So to do this, I created a blueprint and I added a box collision to it, which is what you see here. And I moved that box collision inside of the forest. And I created a handful of structs to be able to specify how many enemies are going to spawn, what type of enemies are going to spawn, and how frequently they will spawn. And I added this logic inside of that blueprint to start spawning these enemies at the correct time. So the game mode is the thing that determines when they spawn. So you can see he'll loop over all these different spawn datas and he'll spawn the correct amount of enemies at the correct time. Next, I populated this spawning data struct with some testing values so that it would spawn a few different enemies in clumps. And I ran it, so you can see it spawns 1, and then it spawns 2, and then it spawns, I think, 4 or 5 after that. And so with that working, I began working on a turret. So I wanted the player to have the ability to obviously defend his base. So to do this, I came up with a turret that when you click on it, it would spawn a projectile, and that projectile would shoot out and explode. And of course, any enemy that it hit would get damaged. So to do this, I simply just created the turret using the pole and one of the pumpkins as the head. And next I needed the actual projectile for it to shoot. So for this I again chose a small pumpkin and I added a sphere collision around it for the actual collision part of it. And the idea is that when the player clicks on the turret, one of these pumpkin bombs would spawn from the head of it and shoot out in the direction that the turret is facing. And I used the projectile movement component for this. This component's great for adding simple projectiles, especially ones that you can see, and unlike ballistics or bullets that oftentimes you just can't even see. Next, I started working on the spawn projectile function, which is going to spawn the projectile, like I said, at the head of the turret and then fire it in the direction you're facing. I added a variable for the speed so I could easily change this because I knew I was probably going to want to change how fast the projectiles came out. And I set up some simple debug code for it to just run on a loop. Next, I wanted to add an explosion, so I went to the marketplace again and grabbed a very simple particle effect and hooked it up to the destroy event so that when the particle gets destroyed, it would blow up. I decreased the speed so you could see it more easily, and that's essentially what it looked like. So I was happy with that. However, the next thing I wanted to do was start working on damage so that the projectiles could actually damage the enemies, which is what I'm doing here. Fortunately, I already had the damage interface set up, so all I had to do was implement it inside of my goblin class and add a little bit of code to handle death. I moved the goblins in front of the turret so they had no choice but to die immediately. And for now, I just deleted them, but you can see right here, I began hooking up a death animation so that when the character got hit, he would play the death animation and then he would get deleted, which is what you're seeing right here. So he gets hit, and then he plays the animation, and then he eventually gets deleted. Now, I still wasn't sure exactly how I was going to do this. I originally started with the pumpkins on the other side, and then I quickly realized that I should have them on my side so that they're easier to click. So eventually I will change that, but this is just me trying to experiment with it and figure out how the game's going to work. Next, I removed the debug code for having them spawn on a loop, and I added a click event so that they would spawn when the player clicks on it. One thing I noticed right here is that when an enemy dies and you try to shoot over it, it still hits the dead enemy's capsule. So to fix that, I decided to totally disable collision on the goblins once they are dead, which is what I'm doing right here. And then after running that and testing that, it seemed to work good. So the next thing I wanted to do was start adding a new enemy type, because right now we just have this goblin. So I decided to go with this skeleton. The first thing I noticed is that he had many different options for what he was wearing. So I thought it'd be cool to randomly generate what he's wearing, or what his attachments are when he spawns, which is what you were seeing right there. So each time you compile him, it switches between what he's wearing slightly, just to give them a bit of variety. Next, just like we did for the goblin, I started working on the AI of him. I added his own behavior tree and his own blackboard, and I reused much of the same code that I had for the goblin, only switched it over to work for the skeleton. And I added him to the spawner as well. So you can see now the goblin and the skeleton both spawn from the spawner. I made the skeleton a bit faster, so he would be a more difficult enemy to fight. And just like we did for the goblin, I started working on his attack animation. Since he had his own skeleton, no pun intended, I mean animation skeleton, I had to make my own animation montage for him as well, which had 2 attacks, just like the goblin, as well as a death. So you can see now the skeleton can run up to the base, and he can do his attacks as well. I was going to make the goblin a bit stronger and hard to kill, and give his attacks a little bit more damage since he was a more rare enemy type. Next, I added the notifies so that you can see now he's actually dealing damage. I also right here am adding a collision cube around the base and using that as the primary collision for whether or not an enemy hits the base. And I was just doing that because it was getting a little bit hard for some of the enemies to hit the pumpkin since it was such an irregular shape. Here is where I finally decide it would be better if I moved the pumpkin turrets to the side with the camera so that they would be easier to click. I also sort of worked on the background a bit to give it more of a enclosed feeling. Like I said, again, I'm not an artist, but I'm just doing what I can. And now this felt a lot better immediately because it was much easier to click on these pumpkins, and you also had a better view of what was going on. And there we go. So at this point, I was going to call it quits because I had worked on it for several hours already, and I thought it was at a good place where I could stop and I could easily continue on it later, adding more enemies or more turret types, and several different features. So this is just some gameplay of the final result. If you guys liked the video, I would appreciate a like and subscribe. I have a Discord channel if you guys want to come and join the channel. It's mostly for game dev, and it's a place where you can meet people, ask questions, get help. I try to answer questions in there as much as I can, but obviously I only have so much time. But anyways, hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I will see you in the next one.